Well, we're in the middle of a series of messages. And in this series, we're unpacking the three things that I guess we as a leadership team think are the three things that will make the biggest positive impact on us as a church. They're the things that we really want to be investing our time and our energy and our resources into. And last week, Fraser looked at number one, which is making disciples. And that's something we've talked about a fair bit, but that's something we want to continue focusing on. And Fraser looked at what it might look like for us to have a culture here at church where all of us are growing as followers of Jesus, but we're also investing and encouraging others in their journey of following Jesus as well. Now, today we're going to be looking at small and large gatherings. And here at Burwood Church, we want to be a church that does gatherings really well. But we also want to do it for the right reasons. We want to do it with the right priorities, and we want it to make in a way that makes the biggest impact for what God is wanting to do in and through our lives. And thirdly, next week, we're looking at community partnerships, and we're going to share some ideas we have about how we can reach out to the community around us and to share God's love in really practical and tangible ways. Now, before we dive into our number two, I want to give you a little bit of an update on what's happening in Kylie and my life for 2023. Now, I'm going to continue being the pastor here at Burwood Church, and so I'll continue being the associate pastor here. So looking forward to that. I do also, though, have an additional role that I've been given, and I'm going to be also the pastor of the Berwick Seventh-day Adventist Church next year. And so that's a small church, but from talking with some of the leaders there, sounds like a church with really great potential, and so we're really looking forward to being a part of that community as well next year. So that's going to take at least 1 week each month of my time. The majority of my time will still be here with Burwood Church, but that's going to be, I'll be sort of a bit divided between those two groups next year. So, small and large gatherings. The big idea I want you to sort of go away with from today is this. Remember our big idea, following Jesus is better together than alone. Now, we certainly see this in other stories in the Bible as well. For example, the very famous story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, let me just sort of repaint the scene if you are not familiar with this story or you haven't heard it for a while. There's this huge sea of people. There's this violent, unpredictable king called King Nebuchadnezzar, and there's this huge golden statue that's been built, and there's this command that goes out. When the music plays, you are to bow down and worship the statue, and if you don't, what's going to happen? You're going to be thrown into the fiery furnace. A terrifying thing. And so everyone is standing there, and in the midst are these three Jewish young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they know that if they want to stay true to God, they are not going to bow down to this statue. But how would they possibly stand in the face of such dangers? And so the music plays, and this sea of people, just imagine them all falling down on their knees and faces and in worship of this statue. And these three men just stand, I imagine them shaking there, wondering what's going to happen. They're shaking, but they're shaking together. And as I think about this story, the question that comes to my mind is, what would have happened if there was just one of them? What would have happened if there was just one? Now, we don't know what would have happened. We're just sort of speculating. But if it was just Shadrach there, would he have stood? Or would the pressure have been too great? I think that there was something about the fact that there was three of them there that allowed them to sort of get this courage from one another. Maybe they were looking to each other going, are we really going to do this? Yes, let's do this. And they stood there together. Following Jesus is better together than alone. I want to share with you a passage from, and here's sort of we're going to be talking a bit more about the reasons why we gather together as a church. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 23 to 25 is an encouragement to us to keep gathering together. And this is what it says. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another all the more as you see the day approaching. Now, this passage here acknowledges the challenges that we have along the journey of following Jesus. It says, Hold unswervingly to that path. Don't give up. Keep going. And to encourage us, it actually points us to two great sources of strength that we can have in our Christian experience. And the first one is Jesus. It says that he who promised is faithful. Jesus is the one who enables us to stand, enables us to step out in faith. He's the one who's trustworthy. He's always faithful. And when we lean upon him, he comes through for us. So Jesus is source of strength, number one. But there's actually a second really big source of strength that we see in this verse. And that's the one that's highlighted by these words. One another. It says, spur one another on. Encourage one another. The reason we are to come together, according to this verse, is because we need to have that continual encouragement. And when we have that encouragement, we'll be willing to go further and be more courageous than we probably would be like we are. Just like that little illustration that Kylie did earlier with the sticks. We are stronger when we are together. Now, it says that not giving up meeting together. And I think what this sort of shows us is that this is one of the primary reasons why we gather. Now, week after week here at Burwood Church, we gather together here as a church community. Why do we do it? Well, there's lots of reasons. We have worship songs, we have teaching, we have all these sort of spiritually enriching things. But I think one of the primary reasons is this thing we're talking about, to have that mutual encouragement. Now, I want to take you back to March 2020. Do you remember what was happening around that time? So I was at the time at the Foresters Beach Seventh-day Adventist Church, and we had been working on a project to build this building. And the church had started it long before I ever got there. In fact, they'd been working on this for about almost 20 years. And they had setback after setback after setback. And it was amazing. Every time they got to that point where they thought they wouldn't go on, God would open up a door and they would continue moving through. But eventually it happened. The church was built, and I remember standing up in March 2020 in front of the church, and I remember just saying, congratulations, we've done it. God has done it. The church is built. Next week, we're going to be gathering in our new building. And everyone cheered and was excited, and it was like such a high day for us as a church. Well, Sunday came, and Monday came, and news about this pandemic began to increase. And I think it was Tuesday or Wednesday, this notice was sent out to all of the churches that we had to suspend all of our public gatherings. And I just remember just being like, you've got to be kidding. Like after all this work, the timing was just like, couldn't have been more sort of like it was literally our first Sabbath in this new building, and in the week leading up to it, our services were put on hold. But beyond that, there was also this sort of sense because ever since I was a kid, we've had this pattern of meeting, coming together, gathering at church every single week without fail. And as a pastor, every church that I've been a part of, every single week without fail, we've gathered together. And now we're going into this period where we are going to suspend our worship gatherings. Like, what's going to happen? How does a church function if we're not meeting together in our building? And now this is what was going on for us at Foresters Beach, but I know it was happening everywhere else as well. It was happening here at Burwood Church. It was happening all over the world, really. And I think what happened as churches encountered this is it really forced us to rethink, well, what does it mean to be church? What does it mean to gather together? Why do we gather together? And who are we if we actually aren't gathering together? And I remember you might have seen lots of these posts that were going up on Facebook. Church is cancelled. And I remember thinking, what? Church is cancelled? Why is it that when the worship service is cancelled that we send out these messages that say church is cancelled? Why is it that we have associated our church experience, our Christian experience so much with the Saturday morning worship service that when it is cancelled, we sort of start wondering, well, we're putting everything on pause. That church is closed. Now, I'm not sure what it was like here. Maybe it wasn't like that. But I know a lot of places we were in New South Wales, they're the sort of things that people were sort of wrestling with. What's left when we're not meeting together in our worship service? And it made me sort of wonder, what if being a disciple is more about what happens between our church gatherings than what happens at them? What do you think about that? What if our church life is more about not what happens here on a Saturday morning, but everything that happens in our lives throughout the week? Why should we be gathering? What's the purpose of this? I want to take you to an experience that Kylie and I had. Kylie doesn't know I'm telling a story, but it's okay, it's not an embarrassing one. About 6 years ago, Kylie and I, we got married and we moved to the Central Coast. And one of the things, we've got our new house that we're going to live in there. And one of the first things you do when you move to a new house is you sort of go and scope out the area. And so we went driving around Batto Bay and we came across this really nice sporting complex. And at this sporting complex was this outdoor basketball court that you could just use at any time that you wanted. And so that was great. And so we thought, well, let's go try it out. So we bought a basketball. And I remember one afternoon we drove down there and we started shooting some hoops. Not that we're very good at basketball, but hey, it was a fun thing to do. And we were there shooting hoops. And on the other side, we were at one end, but on the other side was another couple that were doing the same thing. And after we'd been playing for a little while, the other couple walked up to us and they said, "Hey guys, would you like to join our basketball team?" And it was pretty random. And we were like, we're not really that good at basketball. We're just sort of having a go. And like, don't worry, all of our team is like this as well. Just come along and join us. And we thought, well, look, we're new in the area. What a good opportunity to meet some new people. So we said, sure. And so I remember turning up to the much more professional basketball complex where it was. And it was a mixed team, so it was men and women. And when we got there, we realized that we weren't the only people that had been pulled together in this random basketball team. But the guy who had invited us, he was just one of those guys that's kind of an extrovert, that's just great at just pulling people together. And he had someone from the council where he'd worked that he pulled together, and someone else he'd met he'd pulled together. And we had this real mixed bag of people that they were playing basketball. And when we started playing, it really showed. And so I remember we had no idea what we were doing. There was no structure. We had no sort of strategy or game plan or anything like that. And it was a bit of a disaster. And Kylie would probably agree with me that we didn't do very well. Week 2 comes along, and again, it's not very good. Week 3 comes along, and again, it's not very good. And but by the way, our name for this team was the Last Pick Kids. And so it was a very sort of accurate, I think, description of how we were going in our basketball team. But we started doing something that actually started making a little bit of difference. So we started getting better at this thing that you see on the screen, huddling together. And why do you huddle when you play sports? Well, you huddle to fire each other up. You huddle to strategize and to plan, and you huddle to encourage each other when things aren't going so well. And so we started doing this more. And so I remember beginning of one of the games we were playing, we're there, and we started to develop a bit of a strategy. Defense, all right, you will be here and you'll be here, you'll watch this person, and make sure you do this, and a bit of a plan started to come together. And then when things would go well, we'd huddle in timeout, and then it would be like, you did a great job, great, awesome work, or don't worry about that, no worries. The other person's, some of the people had a bit of an anger problem on our team, which was also a bit embarrassing. But we would fire each other up, and we would get inspired by that. And it was amazing how when we started doing huddles well, we actually started to play the game well as well. And I think this idea of huddles in sport is kind of like a good way to think about the reason why we gather as a church. I want to take you to another one of these passages where Jesus is sending out his disciples. And I want you to sort of picture this as kind of being like a huddle before the game. And so it says, calling the 12 to him, he began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over impure spirits. These were his instructions. So this is like his strategy. This is a game plan. Take nothing for the journey except a staff. No bread, no bag, no money in your belts. Sounds a bit similar to the last time. Wear sandals, but not an extra shirt. Whenever you enter a house, stay there until you leave that town. If any place will not welcome you or listen to you, leave that place and shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them. So here's the coach's inspirational speech here. Then they went out and they preached that people should repent. They drove out many demons and they anointed many sick people with oil and healed them. So they went out and they played the game. And what did they do at the end of it? They huddled back together. And it says, the apostles gathered around Jesus and they reported to him all that they had done and taught. And Fraser sort of hinted at this last week. Like, wouldn't it have been amazing to be there in this huddle? Where everyone's coming back and saying, guess what happened? We met this person, had this experience, and Jesus did this miracle, and this prayer was answered, and this door opened, and that led to this and this and this, and these stories are being shared, and it's re-inspiring them for the next time Jesus sends them out again. And I'd like to suggest that when it comes to our church gatherings, that this makes sense to me. And I know there's more reasons to gather than just this, but I think this is like a big part of it. Remember last week, Fraser was talking about making disciples. Well, you might refer to that as the game. Well, when we gather, that's the huddle before the game, where we fire each other up, where we share stories, where we encourage those that are feeling discouraged or are facing challenges. Now, I wanted to spend a few moments to talk about small gatherings and large gatherings. You would have seen that at the beginning when I shared that. Small and large gatherings. And we want to, as a Burwood Church, do both of these really well. Well, why both? Why not just one or the other? Or is there one of these better than the other? What's the deal with these small and these large gatherings? Well, one of the things just with the dynamics when people come together is that depending on the size of the group, there's some things that come really naturally and easy, and there's some things that are a bit harder. And I want to sort of outline a few of these for you here. So in a large gathering, these are some of the things that sort of come more easily. Firstly, excellent teaching, music, and programs, and things like that. It's easy in a big group because there's such a pool of resources. You can have your best musicians and you can all come together and work together and put together something really spectacular and inspiring. And I think that's an awesome thing about large gatherings. Secondly, a sense of togetherness. I remember last year when we were during the pandemic and we're online, as a new pastor here at Burwood, it was very hard to get a sense of who Burwood Church was. I'd see all these little faces on the screen or would meet with 10 or 20 people over here. But once we started meeting together as a big group all together regularly, I'm like, this is Burwood Church. This is who we are. This is our church family. Thirdly, inspiration. Or when you come together, there's this vibe, there's this connection, there's this thing that inspires us. And fourthly, the breadth. When you have a big group, it's amazing how many people you can interact with in one go. You can reach far and wide in a single morning. Like right now I'm preaching. If I did this many Bible studies with every single person here, do you know how long that would take me? It'd be a long time. There's breadth in a large gathering. But there's some things that are a little bit more tricky. Close relationships. Now you can develop close relationships with a large gathering, but it's much harder. In fact, often it's in the large gathering where people feel most alone. I'm not sure if you ever had that experience. Secondly, authenticity. Now, who wants to come at the front here with all the people here today and to share your deepest, darkest struggles and secrets? Anyone want to do that? I don't probably want to do that. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be authentic in the large gathering. Of course we could, but it's harder. It's a bit more awkward. It's a little bit less natural. Personal learning. Now, if I gave every one of you an opportunity to ask a question right now, how long would that take us? It would take us a long time. There's people in this room who are probably brand new to the Bible, and there may even be someone here who's got a PhD in theology. I don't know. But there's all these different people here today, different stages, and there's one message. There's not a lot of personalization there. It's more challenging in that sense. And finally, depth. And so when you're in a small group, these second lot of things come much more easily. There's much more interaction and question asking and personal learning that happens. You can ask those questions that you really have. And so both of these have their strengths and their weaknesses. And so the question I have is, what did Jesus do? Which one did he lean into more? Any ideas? Well, let's look at some things of what Jesus did. Firstly, here's a story. A few days later, when Jesus again entered Capernaum, the people heard that he had come home. They gathered in such large numbers that there was no room left, not even outside the door, and he preached the word to them. Big gathering or small gathering? Huge gathering, so big that when some people wanted some personal attention, they had to cut a hole in the roof. Okay? Number two, when Jesus landed and saw a crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. The number of the men who had eaten was 5,000. Big gathering or small gathering? Huge. This is just the men. Like, how many people is that in total? Like 15,000 maybe, if you include the women and children, maybe more. This passage verse says, Jesus then left that place and went into the region of Judea and across the Jordan. Again, crowds of people came to him, and as was his custom, he taught them. So it was Jesus' custom to gather large groups of people together and to teach them, because Jesus was for everybody, and everybody needed to hear this message of Jesus, and this was the quickest, fastest way for Jesus to do that. So what did Jesus do? He went into the large gatherings. But is that all that Jesus did? Well, Jesus also did this. It says, Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12 that they might be with him, and they might send them out to preach. And so there's this large crowd, but Jesus then says, you know what? There's an experience that I want some people to have that is actually a deeper experience than we can do with a large group. And I'm going to call out this small group of people, and we're going to have some much more personal, deeper learning that's going to happen in this discipleship group that we're having. And that's what Jesus did. And when you read through Scripture, there's all these like little incidental moments of learning, that personalized learning that happens. I'll give you a couple examples. Then he left the crowd and went into the house. The disciples came to him and said, explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field. Jesus is speaking to the crowds, but when it's in the small group, that's when the questions are being asked. Secondly, one day Jesus was praying in a certain place. When he finished, one of his disciples said to him, Lord, teach us to pray just as John taught his disciples. And so here's these questions. They're seeing Jesus, and there's this learning that's happening from just living life together. And the last verse here, after this, Jesus traveled around from one town and village to another, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him, and also some women. So this small gathering that was with Jesus, they went everywhere with him. They were eating food with him, washing dishes with him, setting up tents with him, going on boat rides with him. And it was in these everyday experiences of life where I'm sure some of the richest lessons that Jesus was teaching were being experienced. What we see when we look at the story of Jesus is that Jesus embraced both of these, the small gathering and the large gathering. And there's this unique experience that we can have in both of these. And as we move forwards at Burwood Church, we see the importance of the large gathering. We love the large gathering, and it's something that has enriched all of our lives. But we also, when we look at the experience of Jesus, we see that there's something about the small gathering that Jesus saw was important, and it had a unique experience to offer to us. And because we are passionate about discipleship here, we want to experience this thing that Jesus has shown us can be found when we meet in those small groups. So we're going to be exploring these as we move further into the future. So let's wrap up. Remember our big idea. Following Jesus is better together than alone. So how can we live this out this week? 3 ideas. And as I share these, maybe the musicians, they can make their way up. Firstly, I want to encourage you to invest in friendship, because there are always going to be times in our lives where the journey that Jesus has laid before us is going to require a little bit more courage and encouragement. And in those times, we need to have that friend by our side. And so I want to encourage you to invest in your friendships with other believers around you. And this takes time. Sometimes this actually says, you know what, I'm going to just put something else important aside to go and invest in this friendship because we need it. But also, more than that, there are other people in this church that need your friendship. And I want to encourage you to look out for some of those people that maybe are newer on their journey with Jesus, or maybe are a bit more fragile in their walk with God, and say, you know, I'm going to carve out some space in my life to be your friend. Secondly, I want to encourage you to create space in your life for gathering, large and small. And as we move into next year, we're going to have more opportunities to gather, especially in those small groups. But it's not easy because life gets so busy. And I know with having a baby in the house, it's just like, where do we ever have time to do all these things? But we don't have much time now. But to fit these sort of things, we have to actually design our schedule in such a way where we actually are carving out some space in our week to invest in these little huddles that are going to be so enriching in our walk with God. And finally, I want to encourage you to think beyond the gathering. I want to encourage you to see our gathering not necessarily as the main event, but the thing that inspires you for the main event, which is that thing that happens each and every day of your life, wherever you find yourself. And so I want to encourage you to remember that discipleship, following Jesus, is better when we do it together.